Hello and welcome to Basics for Gamers presents the basics of hazards in Pathfinder 2nd Edition. Before we begin, it's worth mentioning that this video builds upon information that is delivered in a few of our other videos, notably our video on the thievery skill that explains how disable device is used to disarm traps, and the videos on perception and stealth discuss what it takes to notice something which is important when trying to detect a trap. So you are encouraged to go watch those videos if you haven't already done so. Links to them may be found in the description. Hazards are a group of dangers that players may face during their adventures other than creatures, and they tend to fall into one of three broad categories: environmental hazards, hauntings, and traps. Environmental hazards are typically products of nature, such as a hurricane or a patch of quicksand. Haunts are occult hazards that one might expect to find in a haunted house or a haunted graveyard, and traps are probably what most people think of when it comes to Pathfinder hazards: a giant stone rolling down the hallway, or even a magical trap like a set of exploding runes. Hazards are further divided into two types: simple hazards and complex hazards. A simple hazard is like a landmine. It fires once and then it's done. But complex hazards persist past their first activation and continue to run every turn according to a set routine. Every hazard has some manner of trigger condition. For an environmental hazard like a tornado, the trigger might simply be in close proximity to the tornado. And often these triggers are intentionally hidden, like with most traps. So it's important to know how a player goes about noticing if there is a hazard in their area. Characters should have an opportunity to spot a hazard before it is triggered. The difficulty for this check is listed as the hazard stealth DC, and sometimes will require a minimum proficiency rank in perception in order to be detected. If there is no minimum proficiency listed, then the GM should roll a perception check for each character and compare it to the hazard stealth DC. As long as there is no minimum proficiency listed, then these checks are made for free and do not require the character to take the seek action first. However, if the hazard does have a minimum proficiency listed with its stealth DC, then two things are going to happen. First, no perception checks are made for free. If there is a minimum proficiency listed, then characters must take the seek action in order to spot the hazard. And second, these attempts automatically fail if the seeking character does not meet the minimum proficiency rank in perception, no matter how high their check roll might be. For example, if a hazard stat block says Stealth DC 24 Expert, then anyone who is untrained or trained in perception automatically fails their seek action and doesn't spot the hazard. Also, this is one of those times where a GM might want to make these checks in secret, and since checks are automatically rolled for hazards that do not have a required perception proficiency, you might even fake roll these at random times when players enter a room or a hallway just to keep them on their toes. And a quick note about magical hazards: if the hazard is magical and does not have a minimum listed perception proficiency, then its presence can be detected by using the Detect Magic spell. But this only reveals the presence of magic in the area and nothing else. And again, Detect Magic only works if the hazard does not require a minimum perception rank to spot. If it requires DC 34 trained, then Detect Magic is not going to work on it at all. It doesn't matter if your perception rank is higher than trained or your spellcasting proficiency is higher, none of that matters. If there is any rank listed next to the stealth DC, then it is impossible to spot with the Detect Magic spell. Each hazard stat block shows what needs to occur for it to be triggered. If the condition is to enter an area or step on something in a character's path, then it is assumed that the character does so when they move through that space. But if the trigger calls for something to be manipulated, like opening a door or pulling a lever, then the trigger only occurs if the character specifically performs that action. Also, triggers are either going to be listed as reactions or as free actions. The key distinction here is that hazards, like most characters, only have one reaction per turn. So if the hazard's trigger is a reaction, like a trap door opening to reveal a pit, then it's only going to fire once, no matter how many times players might perform the triggering action. Now compare this to something like quicksand. The trigger for quicksand is a free action, which means it can occur over and over again. In this case, each player who steps into the zone of the quicksand triggers it. Mechanically, this is only possible because the trigger is a free action. When a simple hazard is triggered, it performs the listed effect and then is rendered disabled unless someone resets it. But when a complex hazard is triggered, it persists and runs a predetermined routine. Usually when this happens, the GM is asked to roll initiative for the hazard. If the players were not already in encounter mode, then they roll initiative 2 and the encounter begins. If the players were already in initiative order, then the GM rolls initiative for the hazard and then slots it into initiative as appropriate. And note that unless the hazard stat block says otherwise, it's the hazard's stealth bonus that is rolled for its initiative score. But once this happens, then the hazard acts on its turn just like a monster, except the GM does not directly control the hazard. Instead, the hazard follows its predetermined routine. Since the most common hazard you will face are mechanical traps, the disable device application of the thievery skill is often the best way to manage a hazard. However, there will be times when a good set of thieves tools won't help you, like when dealing with the aforementioned quicksand. A druid or a ranger who is trained in nature or survival may be better equipped to deal with that. And in the same way, a cleric who is skilled in occultism or religion may be your best bet for handling a haunted house. Each hazard will list in its stat block what actions can be used to disable it. This will usually be a skill followed by a DC, and will often show a minimum proficiency rank in parentheses next to it. So for example, if a trap lists Disable Thievery DC 26 Expert, then a thievery check is needed to disable the trap. And if the player is not at least expert in thievery, then they automatically fail. That's simple enough, but one point that is often overlooked is that the stat block shows the skill that is needed, but not necessarily the action. In this case, it shows thievery, the skill, but the application of thievery that you would use is called disable device, and disable device is a 2-action activity. Therefore, in order to disable this trap is not just a thievery skill check, but the player would need to spend 2 actions and use disable device in order to disarm the trap. And magic traps can often be disabled by counteracting them. For the purposes of this video, I'm not going to go too deep into counteracting, but we should definitely look at the most common method of dealing with magical traps, which is by casting Dispel Magic. When Dispel Magic is cast on a magical trap, the caster attempts a counteract check. The base modifier for this check is the same as the caster's base spell attack modifier, which is spellcasting ability modifier plus spellcasting proficiency bonus. However, this counteract bonus may differ from the character's final spell attack bonus because the base bonus is only further modified by conditions that specifically affect counteract checks, not by conditions that modify spell attacks. The DC for the counteract check should be included in the hazard stat block. And the last bit of information you need to know is the hazard's counteract level. This should also be included in the stat block, but if for some reason it's not, you can use the hazard's level divided in half. Once you cast Dispel Magic and roll your counteract check, you then compare that total to the counteract DC in the hazard stat block. On a success, the trap is disabled if that trap's counteract level is no more than one higher than your counteract level. And in this case, your counteract level is the level of the spell slot that is used to cast Dispel Magic. Dispel Magic is a 2nd level spell, but if you heightened it and cast it from a 4th level spell slot, it could disarm a magical trap with a caster level of 5 or lower on a successful counteract check. On a critical success, you disarm the magic trap if it is no more than 3 levels higher than the spell slot you used to cast Dispel Magic. On a failure, you still automatically disarm that magical trap if the trap's counteract level is lower than the spell slot you used to cast Dispel Magic. And on a critical failure, nothing happens. And although not specifically mentioned in the section on counteracting, I think it would be reasonable for the GM to rule that the trap is triggered and goes off when you critically fail a counteract check using Dispel Magic, just like when you critically fail to disable a device using Thievery. With all of this in mind, let's look at a few examples. The first one is pretty straightforward, a common poisoned lock. The first line displays the hazard's traits. In this case, a poison lock has both the mechanical and trap traits. Second is the stealth DC. It says DC 17 trained, which tells us a couple of things. First, no perception checks are made for free to spot this trap because it shows a required proficiency rank. If it just said DC 17 without anything in parentheses, then the players would receive a free proficiency check to detect the trap. But because it requires trained proficiency in perception, only characters who use the seek action have a chance of spotting it. Anyone who is untrained in perception can use the seek action, but will automatically fail when they do so. Then we have a description that provides an explanation of the hazard and a little bit of flavor. And then after the line break, we see some of the more combat-focused stats. First, it shows the requirements to disable it. In this case, a character who is at least trained in the thievery skill can perform the disable device activity, which costs again 2 of their actions, and if they roll a 17 or higher on their check, the trap is disabled. If they critically fail the check, then the trap is triggered. Under that, we have the defense scores for the trap in case someone tries to use brute force and break the trap rather than disable it. This trap has an armor class of 15 and a +8 bonus to fortitude saves and a +4 bonus to reflex saves. The next line shows is hardness, hit points, break threshold, and immunities. I don't want to go too deep into the weeds here, but an object's hardness is an amount of points that are subtracted from every damage roll against the object. Whatever damage is left over is subtracted from its hit points, and when the object is reduced to its break threshold in hit points, it becomes broken. A broken trap no longer functions, but can still be repaired, and if the trap is reduced to 0 hit points, it is completely destroyed and cannot be repaired. In most cases, a trap will automatically be triggered the first time it is hit, unless that single attack does enough damage to break it. Continuing down the stat block, we see the trigger conditions. Here it is a reaction and an attack that is triggered when someone tries to unlock or pick the lock. If either of those occur, then the trap is triggered, and we then look at the effect, which is a spine extends to attack the triggering creature. From there, we just keep going down the stat block and see the attack is a +13 melee attack that deals 1 piercing damage and poison. And below that are the stats for the poison. And I'm going to stop there for now, but if you would like to learn more about how poisons work, check out our video on afflictions. With our next example, let's look at a magical trap. Here we have an electric latch rune trap. This is very similar to the poison lock trap, but we see there are a few more traits detailing the magic that is involved. The stealth heading says DC 20 trained, so remember that even though this is a magical trap, Because it requires trained proficiency and perception, it cannot be detected by casting Detect Magic. Only hazards with no proficiency requirement at all may be affected by casting Detect Magic. And under Disable, we have two options. The first requires an expert thief to use Disable device against DC 20, and the second allows a spellcaster to use Dispel Magic to counteract the trap's magic. And when Dispel Magic is cast, you first need to know what spell slot was used, as that determines the caster's counteract level. And then the caster rolls a counteract check, which is 1d20 plus their spellcasting ability modifier plus their spellcasting proficiency bonus. This is basically the same as making a spell attack roll, except it can be further modified by certain abilities and bonuses that only affect counteract checks and would not be modified by anything that modifies a spell attack roll. We see in the stat block this trap has a counteract level of 2nd and a counteract DC of 18. So if Dispel Magic is cast with a spell slot that is 3rd level or higher, then only a critical failure will prevent the caster from disarming the trap. If Dispel Magic is cast from a 2nd level spell slot, then the caster must roll an 18 or higher on their counteract check in order to disarm the trap. Those were both simple traps, so next we're going to look at a complex one. Here are the stats for a Poisoned Dart Gallery. This trap works very close to how the previous ones work, but there are a few special points we need to make note of. First, we see its stealth heading is different than what we're used to seeing. By default, complex traps display a stealth bonus instead of a stealth DC, and then leaves it to the GM to calculate the stealth DC, which is 10 plus the stealth bonus. Therefore, this trap can only be detected if a character with at least expert proficiency and perception takes the seek action and rolls a 26 or higher. However, this one is a little extra tricky because it shows not only a stealth bonus, but also a stealth DC of 31 master. So in this case, it takes a perception check with expert proficiency of 26 to notice that there is a trap present and you're in danger, but in order to actually disable this trap, you would need to make a perception check with master proficiency against DC 31. As we continue down the stat block, we see the description, disable requirement, and defenses all look normal, but things become different again once we look at the trigger condition. Here the trigger is a reaction and an attack just like with the poison lock. The trigger says a creature enters the hallway or ends its turn in the hallway. So when either of those occur, the trap triggers and the effects occur. Now, if you're wondering how a creature can end its turn in the hallway without first entering that hallway, save that thought, and I promise we will get to that before we're done here. Anyway, once the trap is triggered, we look at the effect. The trap makes a poison dart strike against the triggering creature and then rolls initiative. And this is the biggest difference between simple and complex hazards. When a simple hazard, like a poisoned lock, is triggered, it is one and done. But when a complex trap, like here, when it's triggered, it persists. When this happens, the GM rolls the trap's stealth bonus of plus 16 for its initiative. If the players were already in encounter mode, then the Poison Dart Gallery is slotted into the already existing initiative order. And if the players were not already in encounter mode, then they need to roll initiative too, and the encounter then begins. When it's the trap's turn, the GM looks at its routine. The first thing we see here is that it only has one action per turn. Hazards are not like creatures and are not limited to 3 actions like players are. This one only has 1 action per turn, but other hazards might have 4 actions per turn or 6 or more. And every turn, the trap spends its action to fire 1 dart against every creature in the gallery. The stats for that are below: plus 21 to attack with 3d4 piercing damage and poison. It also notes that the trap does not suffer a multi-attack penalty, so all of those attacks are made with a plus 21 bonus. In addition to that, we also see it has a free action called Continuous Barrage. Every time a character within the gallery completes an action, not completes their turn, but every time they complete an action, this hazard fires another dart at them. So if they take 3 actions while inside the gallery, then this hazard attacks them 3 times during their turn, in addition to the 1 time the hazard attacks them during its turn. And below that, we see the stats for the poison that may be inflicted with the darts. Last, at the very bottom of the stat block, we see it says reset. The trap deactivates and resets after 1 minute. What this means is once the trap is triggered, it remains active for 1 minute or 10 encounter rounds. So if the characters leave the gallery and come back to it during that minute, the trap is still active. But 1 minute after it is first triggered, the trap stops and resets, meaning it must be triggered again before it will operate. This is also aware of that effect condition that says a creature that enters the hallway or ends its turn in the hallway triggers the trap. This is where that comes into play. It is possible for a creature to have already entered the hall when its minute is up and it resets. Which means if they are still inside the hall, when they finish their next turn, they trigger the trap again. If the trigger condition only said creatures that enter the hallway, then anyone who is already in the hall at the time it resets would be immune from triggering it again. In this video, we discussed hazards. Hazards are dangers in the game other than creatures and typically fall into one of 3 categories: environmental hazards like storms and earthquakes, hauntings like a haunted mansion or a ghost ship, and traps. And hazards are further divided into 2 types: simple hazards and complex hazards. Simple hazards are triggered once and then become inert unless they are reset again. Complex hazards persist after they are triggered, they are placed in initiative order just like a monster, and they run a predetermined routine when it is their turn. Detecting hazards functions much the same way as spotting anything else. All hazards have a stealth DC. For complex hazards, this is usually displayed as a stealth bonus, and the GM needs to know that the stealth DC is 10 plus that bonus unless otherwise noted in the stat block. If the hazard does not list a required minimum proficiency for perception, then all players receive a free perception check when they enter the general area of the hazard. This mostly applies to environmental hazards. A hailstorm isn't trying to hide from anyone. But if the hazard has any requirements for perception, then a player must take the seek action and meet the minimum perception requirements to spot the hazard. Also note that if a magical hazard does not have a minimum perception requirement, then it may be found by casting Detect Magic, but that spell only informs the caster of the presence of magic and does not provide any assistance in disabling the hazard. Each hazard stat block lists a triggering condition that needs to be met in order to activate the hazard. These are listed as either reactions or free actions. The important distinction here is if the trigger is a free action, then it fires repeatedly every time the triggering condition is met, whereas if it is a reaction, then the trigger only fires once. After the trigger occurs, the GM applies the listed effects of that trigger. For complex hazards, this usually includes rolling initiative for the hazard, which, unless otherwise noted in the stat block, is its stealth bonus. For these complex hazards, they will perform the listed routine every round on their turn. And note that hazards have no limit to the number of actions they have per turn. Instead, each stat block should list the number of actions the hazard receives and how to spend them every turn. Hazards also display conditions to disable them. For environmental hazards, these are usually nature or survival checks. For haunts, these are occultism or religion checks. And for mechanical traps, you usually use the disable device application of the thievery skill, which, don't forget, is 2 actions, not 1. If the hazard is magical, you might also be able to disable it by casting Dispel Magic. When you do so, you roll a counteract check comparing your counteract level, which is the level of the spell slot used to cast Dispel Magic, versus the counteract level listed in the hazard stat block. You then roll a counteract check, which has the same base bonus as a spell attack roll, except it is only further modified by conditions that specifically say they modify counteract checks. And then compare that total to the counteract DC listed in the hazard stat block. Hazards, especially traps, might also be disabled through brute force in attacking them. Traps are triggered the first time they are hit by an attack unless the attack drops it below its break threshold or to 0 hit points. If the trap does not display a break threshold, then it must be reduced to 0 hit points with the first hit to prevent it from triggering. And some hazards display reset information as well that details what needs to occur for the hazard to return to its default state and be ready to trigger again. With that, we'll bring this video to a close. If you found this video helpful, please give us a like, and don't forget to click that subscribe button and the bell so you never miss out on our future videos. Leave us a comment letting us know what topics you'd like to see covered in our future videos, and we can always be reached through our Twitter and Facebook pages too. If you'd like to use some of the maps that we feature in our videos in your own games, you can find them at Maps of Mastery. A link to that store can be found in the description. Thanks for watching, take care, and we'll see you soon with more basics for your favorite tabletop games.